Welcome to the Confessional Booth. I'm your host, Marie Wagner. I am a certified sex, love, and relationship coach, as well as a hands-on de-armoring practitioner. The Confessional Booth is a safe space where we bring voice to what has been hidden, where we explore the things that shape us beneath the surface, and it's a place where shame and other internal blockages begin to lose their grip. As a result, we can start to experience more freedom, energy, joy, pleasure, and to ultimately feel more fully ourselves. Let's begin. There is something that happens when we finally say the thing we have been carrying alone. And I don't mean that it necessarily disappears. I don't mean that the past suddenly becomes okay. And I don't mean that speaking one sentence magically heals a trauma or repairs a relationship or changes the entire course of our lives. But something does change. Something moves. And we've been really spending a lot of time understanding shame and where it comes from, how it affects the body, how it shapes our nervous system, how it changes our behaviors, how shame influences our relationships, and even our sexuality. And now I want to begin talking about what happens when we start releasing it. And I think one of the first ways we begin releasing shame is through language, through giving words to the things that have been living inside of us without a name, because there is a very particular kind of suffering that comes from carrying something alone. Sometimes it is trauma, sometimes it is grief, sometimes it is a desire that we have never allowed ourselves to acknowledge. Sometimes it is anger. Sometimes it is simply the truth of how we feel in a relationship. And I think many of us know what it is like to have a sentence or a phrase sitting inside of us. We know what we want to say. We have rehearsed it in our head. We have had the conversation in the shower or as we're getting ready. We have had it while driving or in meditation. We have imagined what we would say if we were finally brave enough. And then the moment arrives, and suddenly our throat tightens, the words disappear, we laugh, we change the subject, we say, it's fine. Or we say, it's not the right time. And we go home carrying the exact same thing we arrived with. This is where I think we need to be very careful about how we understand confession. Because I don't believe confession is about forcing ourselves to reveal everything. I don't believe we owe everyone access to our most intimate experiences. Privacy is healthy. Boundaries are healthy. Discernment is incredibly important. So when I talk about confession, I am talking about the experience of bringing something that has been hidden into conscious awareness, and then when it is safe and appropriate, allowing it to be witnessed. And that witnessing can be another person. For example, it can be a therapist, it can be a coach, it can be a trusted friend, it can be a partner. Sometimes it can begin with ourselves, because there is a difference between having an experience and being able to acknowledge that we had the experience. And I think this is where Carl Jung becomes so relevant. Jung spoke about the shadow, which we have talked about in previous episodes, the parts of ourselves that have been pushed outside of conscious awareness, the emotions we were not allowed to feel, the needs we were not allowed to have, the desires we were taught to judge. And what I find so interesting about the shadow is that it does not simply disappear because we refuse to look at it. It continues influencing us, often and most often without our knowing. It continues looking for expression, and sometimes it begins expressing itself through our behavior. For example, we can become irritable, or we become controlling, we become withdrawn, we become sexually disconnected, we become chronically busy, we become obsessed with productivity. We become the person who is always helping everyone else and has no idea what they actually need. And then we look at our lives and wonder why we feel so disconnected from ourselves. James Hollis writes extensively about the unlived life, and I think there is a beautiful connection here, because many of us are not only carrying the things that happened to us, we are also carrying the parts of ourselves that never got to be lived. The person we might have become if we had felt safe enough to speak. The relationship we might have had with our body if we had not learned to hate it. The desires we might have explored if we had not been taught that wanting was shameful. The creativity we might have expressed if we had not been so concerned with being acceptable. Sometimes confession is the first moment where those parts of us begin to come back into the room. You might say something very simple. For example, I actually don't like this. I am angry, or I feel angry. I am lonely, or I feel lonely. I want more. I don't know what I want. I am afraid. I don't feel safe. I have been pretending I am okay. These are just a few of so many examples. And suddenly there is a part of you that has been standing outside the conversation for years, and you have finally invited it in. I think this is one of the reasons speaking can feel so emotionally powerful, because the words are often carrying much more than the words themselves. When someone says, I am angry, or I feel angry, they may also be saying, I have been swallowing my needs for years. When someone says, I don't want to have sex, they may also be saying, I have been disconnecting from my body because I do not feel safe enough to feel. When someone says, I want to be desired, they may also be saying, I have spent years believing my body is something I need to hide. When someone says, I am lonely, they may also be saying, I have been performing connection without allowing myself to be known. This is why I believe language is so powerful. It allows us to begin separating the layers, the event from the emotion, from the meaning, from the belief, from the behavior, from the body. Because often these things become fused together. Something happens. We feel something. We create a meaning. The nervous system responds. And then the behavior begins. For example, imagine a young child who expresses anger and is repeatedly told that they are bad when they are angry. The original emotion is anger. The meaning becomes, my anger makes me bad. The nervous system begins associating emotional intensity with rejection. The muscles around the jaw and throat may become chronically tense. The breath may become restricted whenever conflict arises. The person grows up and becomes very agreeable. They are easy to be around. They rarely complain. They say yes. And then, years later, they develop chronic resentment. They have no idea how to set a boundary. They may experience headaches, jaw tension, neck pain, or digestive symptoms that become worse during relational stress. And they may say, I don't know why I'm so unhappy. This is where I think the body becomes incredibly important, because the body is often communicating information that the conscious mind has not yet been able to articulate. When we speak something that has been hidden, we're not simply changing our thoughts. We are changing the relationship between the brain and the body. We are taking an experience that has existed primarily as sensation, reaction, or unconscious behavior and beginning to give it language. There is a reason people often say they feel lighter after talking about something. And I want to be very clear here, because I think the phrase feeling lighter can sound sometimes a bit abstract. However, there can be a very real physiological experience underneath it. You see, when we are carrying shame, the body often lives with a degree of muscular bracing. The shoulders elevate, the jaw tightens, the diaphragm becomes restricted, the breath becomes shallow, the pelvic floor can hold tension. The nervous system remains vigilant, scanning for cues that we might be exposed, rejected, or judged. This constant monitoring requires energy. It is work. And when we finally speak something and experience safety, the body can begin to reduce that level of protection. The exhale naturally lengthens. The heart rate may even settle. Muscular tension decreases. The digestive system begins receiving more parasympathetic support. The body moves away from constant sympathetic activation. And for some people, that can feel like a deep sigh, a wave of fatigue, or tears, or shaking, or warmth, or a sense of spaciousness. The body is processing a change in information. And this is where I want to bring in Stephen Porges again and his work with polyvagal theory, because the concept of neuroception is so relevant here. Your nervous system is constantly scanning for cues of safety and danger that are below our level of perception. So imagine that for years you have carried the belief, if people really know me, I will be rejected. Then you finally tell someone something deeply personal, and they stay. They listen. They do not pull away. They do not shame you. They do not look at you with disgust. Your conscious mind may say, that went well, but your nervous system is receiving something much deeper. It is receiving new data, new information. I revealed something and remained connected. That is a physiological experience. And over time, repeated experiences like this begin updating the nervous system. This is why I think confession can be healing when it happens in a safe and relational context. The healing is not simply in the telling, it is in the experience that follows. I tell the truth. I remain connected. I am seen. I survive being seen. And perhaps I am even loved more honestly because I'm finally allowing myself to be known. Brene Brown has written extensively about shame and the power of bringing shame into the light. And I think one of the reasons this works is because shame requires isolation. Shame says, keep this to yourself. Nobody else feels this way. If people knew, they would reject you. And the moment we begin speaking, we create the possibility of discovering that our experience is human. This is one of the things I find so profound in my work. People will sit across from me and tell me something they genuinely believe nobody else has ever experienced. And I will listen, and I will often think quietly, I have heard this before, or I have experienced this for myself as well. And not because their experience is unimportant, but because human beings are much more similar than we think. The details vary, the story changes, the culture changes, the relationship changes, but the underlying human experiences of fear, shame, longing, grief, desire, betrayal, and the need to belong are incredibly universal. And when someone discovers that, something begins to shift. They are no longer the only person in the world carrying this particular feeling. John Bradshaw's work around shame is incredibly relevant here because he spoke about shame as something that becomes part of identity. So the difference between guilt, like I did something that I regret, and shame, saying to yourself, I am bad. That distinction matters because if I believe I am bad, then speaking becomes incredibly dangerous. And I am not simply revealing something I did. I am revealing who I believe I am. And this is why some people become so quiet around certain parts of their lives. The silence is protecting an identity. If I never speak about my sexuality, I never have to confront the belief that something is wrong with me. If I never talk about my trauma, I never have to feel the grief associated with what happened. If I never admit that I am unhappy in my relationship, I never have to face the possibility that I might have made a mistake. Silence can become a form of psychological protection. And again, the nervous system is involved. The body is constantly making calculations about risk. What will happen if I say this? What will happen if I ask for that? What will happen if I tell the truth? And when the perceived risk is greater than our nervous system's capacity to tolerate the outcome, we remain silent. This is why I think healing requires more than simply telling people to speak their truth. And I actually dislike that phrase when it is used without context, because some people have been silenced for so long that they need to learn how to identify their truth before they can even speak it. They need to reconnect with their body. They need to notice what happens when they say yes. They need to notice what happens when they say no. They need to recognize the difference between desire and obligation, between fear and intuition, between a genuine boundary and a protective wall. This is where the emotional and psychological work meets the body. You might think you are confused, but your body may be communicating very clearly. You feel your chest contract when you say yes. You feel your stomach drop when you agree to something that you do not want to do. You feel your shoulders tense when someone asks for access to you. You feel your breath deepen when you imagine saying no. The body is giving you information, And when we have lived in shame for a long time, we often have to learn how to listen again. I also think there is a spiritual dimension to confession that is worth acknowledging. And when I say spiritual, I am not necessarily referring to religion. I am talking about the relationship we have with the deeper sense of self. Part of us that knows when we are living in alignment and when we are abandoning ourselves. There is something deeply exhausting about living a life that requires constant self-betrayal. Saying yes when we mean no. Pretending to be happy. Pretending not to want. Pretending not to care. Pretending we are fine, stonewalling and pretending we feel nothing. Eventually, the distance between the person we present to the world and the person we actually are becomes very difficult to sustain. There is a kind of soul fatigue that happens when we repeatedly leave ourselves behind. When we finally begin telling the truth, we begin returning to the body, returning to our emotions, coming back to our own mind, coming back to the parts of ourselves we abandoned in order to belong. And I think that is why confession can feel so profound, because at its deepest level, confession is not simply about telling another person the truth. It is about ending the relationship we have with ourselves that requires us to remain hidden. And I want to be really careful here. Speaking the unspeakable does not mean we have to tell everyone everything. There are things that require professional support. There are experiences that need careful containment. There are relationships that are not safe enough to hold our truth. There is wisdom in discernment. But I do believe that what we refuse to acknowledge has a way of continuing to influence us. It moves into the body. It shapes our nervous system. It affects our behaviors. It influences our relationships. It changes our capacity for intimacy and pleasure. And psychologically, it can become part of the identity we build around ourselves. When we begin to speak, something changes across every level of our being. Physiologically, the nervous system can begin receiving new information about safety, connection, and belonging. Emotionally, feelings that have been suppressed can finally move through the body. Mentally, we can begin separating what happened from the meaning we've created about ourselves. And spiritually, we begin returning to a more integrated relationship with who we actually are. This is why I believe confession can heal. The truth does not always make life easier immediately. Sometimes the truth contains change. Sometimes it contains grief. Sometimes it creates consequences. Sometimes it requires a boundary. Sometimes it asks us to leave something that no longer fits. But there is an extraordinary amount of energy required to remain hidden. And when we stop spending that energy protecting ourselves from being known, that energy becomes available for something else, for connection, creativity, pleasure, desire, presence, for life. And maybe this is where we begin releasing shame. We begin speaking. We begin listening. We begin allowing the body to discover that the truth can exist inside us without destroying us. And slowly, over time, the parts of ourselves we thought we had to hide begin to realize they are finally allowed to come home. This is the confessional booth. If you like this episode, please rate it and subscribe and refer it to anyone you know who might benefit. To find out more about what I offer, head over to my website, mariewagner.ca, on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn at Marie Wagner, and on Instagram at the Marie Wagner Coach. Thanks for being here. See you in the next episode.